Hello friends, welcome back to another Year in the Bible video. You're looking at someone who has completed reading through the Bible in 1 year. I actually just a little bit ago finished Revelation, and I'm really excited about it. I'm going to kind of talk through these last 5 books of the Bible in this video, and I'm going to follow up with another video in a week or two before the end of the year where I kind of reflect on the process as a whole. But yeah, it was really cool to read Revelation. I actually did decide to sit down. I waited a couple days so I had some time, and I sat down today and read the entire book of Revelation in one sitting. Yes, it was intense, but it was possible and it was doable, and it was really cool. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually recording this about 3 weeks before the end of the year, so I actually got it done a little bit early, which is cool. So that if you go back to the very first video where I kind of mapped out my plan, I was able to stick to that and kind of get ahead of it a little bit even. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. But so 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation in this video. One of the things I noticed right away when I started reading 1st John was how familiar it felt. And that's because it was just a few weeks ago that I read the Gospel of John. And it literally, the way, the language, the way of writing, that kind of, I think I said in the Gospel of John that it's more of a philosophical look at the life of Jesus than maybe the other 3 synoptic Gospels are. And that's what this feels like. You're reading Hebrews and James and 1st and 2nd Peter, and then you get to John, it's like, oh, the language changes a little bit. And you're like, oh, I recognize this. It's kind of cool to see that theme and that pattern. And it's very beautifully written, I would say. I underlined, obviously, and highlighted in my Bible this section in chapter 4 of 1 John about God is love. And I'm just going to read this to you because it really meant a lot to me. Beloved, let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone knows who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent His only Son into the world so that we might live through Him. In this love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God lives in us and His love is perfected in us. I mean, that's really the summation of all 3 of John's letters is it's about love. God is love, and therefore we should be people of love. If I had to sum up everything about John's letters here at the end of the New Testament, that kind of seems to be the overarching theme. I mean, John is clearly, in a very pastoral way, writing to some churches, and similar to the other epistles, he's encouraging them to press on in their faith despite persecution. He's several times challenging them to be wary of false teaching and people who might lead them astray. I think one of the things historically we know now about the letters of John is that there were those who were teaching that Jesus did not actually have a physical body, that He was a spiritual being, not a physical being, and John seems to be pushing back against that and saying, no, He really was alive, He really died, and He really was resurrected. So then you have that in 1 John, that epic passage about love. Then you go to truth and love, the kind of combination of those two. In 2 John, a very, very short letter, and then a third letter, the same one, kind of calling out a few people saying, hey, watch out for this person, but commendations towards this person. It feels very personal, kind of more for that little short, brief letter for 3rd John. Jude, I think most scholars believe that Jude was written by one of the brothers of Jesus, Judah. And again, he's worried about false teachers. He's worried about what the church is being led to believe by people who are coming in and leading the church. The biggest section here from verse 5 all the way down to verse 23 of Jude, which it's only, in my Bible, it's 1 page, right? It's about judgment on false teachers, warnings, being careful against them. So clearly this was an important, if you're thinking about this as not just a spiritual guidebook for us today, but also like a historical document from 2,000 years ago. We're getting all of these letters where we see that the early church movement was wrestling with things. They were figuring out what it meant to be Christ followers in their world, just like you and I are trying to figure out what it means to be a Christ follower in our world. And there are things that had to be specifically addressed. And I think the truth remains the same for me as I read these letters, particularly when I think about being careful what you listen to and what's being taught, and making sure that it falls in line with what the apostles handed down from Jesus Himself, and to kind of go back to that as a foundation, right, of who we are and what we believe and how we live this thing out, which is what they're talking about. Last but not least, the final book of the Bible, perhaps one of the most talked about books of the Bible ever, Revelation. I actually, just because I've been teaching this class at Belmont, and we obviously ended with Revelation, I spent some time with it before I read it, so it was kind of good to read it from a perspective where I had just like done like a chapter in a textbook about it. And one of the things I learned actually was that the word revelation, to reveal, it's based, it's the Greek word to reveal, revelation, is what we get the word for apocalypse. And apocalypse is a type of literature from a couple thousand years ago. Like all of the symbolism and everything in here that I honestly don't understand all of it. It would have been a more familiar type of writing to the original readers of John's Apocalypse, of the Revelation of John. And that was a style of writing where you think about it, like living in Roman-occupied world, you can't just write things about Roman governors and Caesars and things like that. You had to veil it. And so a lot of times it's pointing towards the culture and the powerful regimes in place and things like that. So I think it would have been a little bit easier for us to wrestle with this a couple thousand years ago. And I'm not going to sit here and explain Revelation to you because I can't. And I actually want to spend some more time diving into it. But I found the process of reading it straight through in one sitting. It took me 30, 45 minutes. Chapter 1 all the way through chapter 22. Now granted, again, I just taught through this, so I have a little bit more information in my mind about it. But what I was going to say is I feel like that 1 through 22 reading straight through allowed me to kind of see the bigger picture, right? John is clearly weaving a story together, these visions that he's had, and it's the visions he's had, and it makes more sense when you kind of see it as a collected whole. When you're not cherry picking a verse here and there and going, what does it mean? When you see it in the grander narrative, I think that's cool. I mean, it starts out with 7 little miniature letters to 7 churches in these first 3 chapters. And to me, it felt a lot like what we read from the Apostle Paul in all of those epistles, just more abbreviated versions of it. But it's like, hey, this is what you're doing well. This is what you're not doing well. I want to commend you to stand strong. I mean, obviously, there's like questions about persecution. There's questions about what's going to happen. Like, why hasn't Jesus returned yet? And he's trying to give them like, hey, stay faithful. I think that's what these letters are saying. Stay faithful. Focus on what you've been told and what you've been taught. But then it kind of takes this turn into chapter 4. He says, I looked up, and there in heaven a door stood open. So John is getting a picture into the throne room. I love chapter 4 and chapter 5, and I would say, these holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, these beautiful pictures, and it's so many different beings and angels worshiping God. But one of the things I love about this is we get to the scroll in chapter 5, and John is weeping because no one is worthy to open the scroll. And then one of the angels looks to him and says, the elders, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll. Jesus is described as a lion, as the root of Jesse. But when John turns to see him, I turned, and between the throne for the 4 living creatures among the elders, a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. So when it's spoken about Jesus, he's described as a lion. But when John turns to see him, he is a slaughtered lamb that is living. How beautiful, the lion and the lamb. How beautiful is that picture? That struck me as so powerful. And it was just really meaningful for me to think about that, about who Jesus is. I think one of the things about Revelation is we try to make sense of how it's all going to end. Maybe one of the questions we need to be asking is, who is Jesus in all of this? In chapter 6, those seals start to get opened, right? And things kind of, to say all hell breaks loose is true. Maybe all heaven breaks loose. But at that point is where it gets pretty wild. And the story kind of all of these different visions and these, the number 7 is repeated many times. But at this point, it's like we're getting into some really apocalyptic, because that's the style of literature it is, some really apocalyptic language, visions. I know, because of having studied it, that a lot of this is pointing towards things that were actually happening back then a couple thousand years ago. Some of it is pointing towards the future. It's very, very confusing. I don't sense that, the big takeaway from this is, we're all going to get left behind, right? I don't. Like, that's not where I sense. But I honestly don't have my head and my heart fully wrapped around, if I'm just being honest, what it all means and how it all clicks. I'm not sure that we're supposed to. I'm honestly not. But but I do think it's a beautiful picture of there is a beautiful, a harsh, a scary picture of the reality of what we face and the reality of evil that's very present in the world, and God's goodness, but also God's justice, and kind of something has to be reconciled, right? And it's a pretty wild picture. I mean, dragons and beasts and women and all this. I mean, it's just kind of wild. I will say this. Reading through all of that as one kind of narrative, you could kind of see the thread, like the timeline of it almost, which was really helpful, as I said earlier. And then I would say perhaps the most important thing about Revelation is how the story ends, right? You get to chapter 21 and 22, and we see a new heaven and a new earth that has come out of heaven and is now, God is dwelling among the people. See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things has passed away. All I know is that when you're reading the end of the story, right, when we then get to the river of life and the new, there is no need for a temple because God is there, Jesus is there, the new Eden, this new garden-like place, that the way this story began, that I started reading 11 months ago, right, the goodness of creation, the harmony of that garden. However this ends, it's going back to that, right? And for me personally, and for you, right, while you're watching this, like whatever you're going through right now, there's going to be no more of that when all things are made new. There's going to be no more death, no more sickness, no more crying, no more pain. God is up to something, and all things are going to be made new. And in the big picture of this story, of this book, right, the way that it began over here in this beautiful, good, perfect garden, right? In here, everything went wrong in 1,000 different ways. And you and I, we have inherited that. People screwed it up. But Jesus, the lion and the lamb, the embodiment of God's love that 1 John talked about, he has come to save the day. And when it's done, I don't know when that's going to happen, and I can't really make sense of everything that's going to happen between now and then. When it's done, it will be good. Amen. This was an incredible day for me to read this book and to think about it. And like I said, I need to process a little bit more and think through what the last year has meant to me, and I'm going to make a follow-up video about that. But this has just been a really special thing, and to kind of just see the ending and to know that you and I are living in that in-between. We're living in the in-between of when this was written and when it's going to be made whole, when it's going to be renewed. And this was a really meaningful process for me, and this is a good book. This is a really good book. And so I want to thank all of you who've been on this entire journey with me. There's several of you who've been here from the very beginning, and a bunch who've come in later. A lot of the encouragement that I've received from you is, honestly, there were days where I was like, why did I do this? Why did I commit to making all of these videos? And this is like, but I'm glad that I had that. I'm glad that I had that accountability, and I'm glad that I've finished this. So again, I'm going to follow up with another video and kind of process the whole thing a little bit more. I'm clearly already starting to do that, but and then I'm going to dive into the Apocrypha. I'm going to read that a little bit, and I'm going to try to figure out what my next kind of Bible reading plan is going to be after this, because I finished it, but I'm not done reading it, right? I'm going to keep going for the rest of my life. So again, thank you for your encouragement. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I'll see you next time.